Congress must be a check on the executive on certain kinds of acts, including declarations of war and the use of military force.
That's the voice of Congresswoman Katie Porter, representative for the 45th Congressional District in Orange County, California. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, have you seen any cicadas yet?
Well, hi, Michelle. Yes, it is beautiful springtime in Washington. The cicadas are indeed out. I saw the first one in my yard just yesterday. And masks are coming off. So, this may not be the end of the pandemic yet, and it is certainly not in many countries. But it's nice to see some normalcy returning to Washington. But let's turn to this week's nuclear news. Michelle, what do you have lined up on early warning?
Well, first, we take a look at Israel's position toward the Iranian nuclear deal, given the current momentum in Vienna and in light of the escalating violence that we're seeing in the region. And then on a different note, as we enter the next phase of the pandemic, we discuss what the future of work looks like in the national security sector.
And next, we will have Farshad Farahat. He is an actor, director, and board member of Plowshares Fund. He sits down with U.S. Representative Katie Porter, who is serving her second term in Congress, representing California's 45th Congressional District. They discuss the need for no first use policy, as well as congressional oversight of the U.S. nuclear weapons program. Porter also explains how U.S. foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific region is contributing to the rise of hate crimes here and how it relates to the Asian American community. So please stay with us.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps to grow our show and our audience. We really appreciate any and all feedback. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Dr. Doreen Horschig, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund, and Laicie Heeley, founder and CEO of Inkstick Media. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Michelle.
As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. Doreen, the Israeli government has been opposed to the United States rejoining the JCPOA. You just published an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists about how this position to some extent may actually reflect public opinion in Israel. With the momentum of the ongoing negotiations, has the Israeli government shifted its positions at all?
Yeah, Michelle, this is an excellent question, but I'm afraid the answer is fairly straightforward. No, the current Israeli government hasn't shifted its opposing position. And, as long as Benjamin Netanyahu remains prime minister, we're really unlikely to see any changes. He's been vehemently opposed since the deal has been introduced in 2015. Netanyahu is trying to convince the US that a return to the JCPOA would be a mistake unless major flaws are addressed. And Israel is so opposed because it believes that Tehran never abandoned its ambition to become a nuclear armed state. And that, the nuclear deal really helps this ambition. And some other major concerns include questions about the sunset clause, the exclusion of Iran's ballistic missile program, and the IAEA's ability to fully inspect Iran's research sites and activities. But when we look at the history so far, Iran made major advancements when the JCPOA was not in full effect. It violated the terms of the agreement once the US withdrew. And then Iran responded with increased uranium enrichment in response to the recent attack on its Natanz facility. And this attack was one of several counterproliferation efforts that Israel regularly engages in. We've seen the country use a campaign of sabotage and assassination to cripple the Iranian program for years. But were these actions more effective in halting the Iranian nuclear program? Not really. If the deal is not revived, the likelihood of Iran becoming a nuclear power is just as high or as some argue even higher. So US withdrawal and Israeli sabotage have effectively moved that sunset clause forward to the present day, as Iran has enriched uranium to its highest purity yet. So coming back to your original question, despite the momentum in Vienna, Israel has not shifted its position. And if anything, then it's more so hardening its position.
Of course, we are having this conversation in the midst of several crises for Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu was unable to form a government following a recent election, and now his rival has been given the opportunity to try instead. And we are also witnessing severely escalating violence stemming from the Israeli government's efforts to physically claim Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem and an incursion into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Are these crises affecting Israel's foreign policy?
Yeah, so seeing this violence escalate in these past days has been absolutely devastating, and there's really no end in sight at the moment. And, while the events are surely affecting the domestic politics in the country, it's unlikely that we'll see a major shift in Israeli foreign policy, especially because the current escalation bolsters Netanyahu's domestic agenda. The violence has given him a renewed chance of remaining prime minister, shortly after it seemed as if he might be on the way out. And the current crises give him a chance to be a victorious leader, not only of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but one of domestic politics. So, if the government doesn't change and Netanyahu is not removed, foreign policy is unlikely to see a major change. Let's take Israel's relationship with Iran, for example. Iran is funding Hamas, the militant group that is, as we know, a key player in the current crisis. But the relationship between Israel and Iran is already a very hostile one. So the hostilities will continue, but that's in line with current Israeli foreign policy. And then we have the US and Israel, but it's also unlikely that we'll see a major change in US-Israeli foreign policy. So, but we might see some shift from other countries' foreign policies towards Israel, especially if Israel is unwilling to discuss a ceasefire. Many are stunned by the escalation of the violence, and they might start to put more pressure on Israel. But as of right now, Israel's own foreign policy is largely the same.
Thanks, Doreen. Laicie, last week Inkstick Media published an op-ed titled "Flexibility Alone Won't Fix Our Toxic Culture," written by Kelsey Davenport, which detailed how creating flexibility in the workplace during the pandemic, while much needed, must go hand in hand with cultural changes. And it sparked a big conversation in the field. This op-ed was one of a series that Inkstick has been publishing called The Future of National Security Work. What have you experienced and learned over the course of creating this series?
Kelsey's piece absolutely did spark a big conversation, and a number of these pieces have sparked a lot of conversation in the field. I've been really glad to see it. One thing that we've learned that's been quite surprising as we've been publishing this series of pieces and having this broader conversation about the future of national security work is that a lot of folks have preferences, right? They would rather go back to the office. They would rather be home. They're introverted. They're extroverted. They have different ways that they prefer to work, and they have different ways that they work better. And so an obvious place that we might go is of course, flexibility. Yes, flexibility is a great idea, but that's only the first step. This goes way beyond personal preference and the way that folks like to work. It goes deep, deep, deep into questions of inclusivity and who is at the table, folks with disabilities, folks with chronic illnesses, folks who grow up in small towns or in with different socioeconomic status have access when we move more virtual and when we allow more flexibility. And that is something that I think needs to be at the core of any conversation going forward about the future of national security work, is this really is not just about a personal preference and making us more efficient in our workday. This is actually about changing the conversation, changing the way that we, what we're all working toward, a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment that can allow us to have a conversation that represents the American people. The way that we do that is to rethink the way that we work in the future in order to include more people.
So what prompted you to create this series?
So I was having a lot of really, really amazing discussions behind the scenes with different groups, and Square, gender champions included, orgs in solidarity, really, really good conversations happening in meetings with a sort of a closed group of people within the field. There was a huge opportunity to bring some of these conversations to the rest of the field and to elevate them and to begin to make this a conversation that we were all having publicly. Because as much as we can talk about this in closed rooms, having the conversation publicly is the only way to really move it forward. That has changed it completely. And that's really helped us learn as all these things that we now understand about this future of work, having such a broad reach. It's a direct consequence of having moved the conversation to the public.
And before we go, where can listeners go to read all these op-eds?
Folks can go to inkstickmedia.com, and we'll include a link that goes straight to the series in the show notes.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Join us for Momentum Chain Reaction 2021 on Monday, June 7th, live via Zoom, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Together, we'll commemorate 40 years of bold action by Plowshares Fund to promote peace and security around the world and to celebrate the momentum we carry forward to position people, not nuclear weapons, at the forefront of our national security and budget priorities. The event is free and open to all. For more information, visit plowshares.org/chainreaction2021.
Welcome, everyone, to Press the Button. My guest today is Congresswoman Katie Porter. Congresswoman Porter represents the 45th Congressional District in Orange County, California. Rep. Porter is a member of the House Oversight and Reform Committee and is a leader in the fight to protect taxpayers and crack down on waste, fraud, and abuse. Katie, my friend, thank you for joining us and welcome to Press the Button.
I'm grateful for the chance to be here.
Here at Plowshares Fund, one of our main missions is to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons. Do you believe the U.S. nuclear weapons program is an area that needs more congressional oversight?
Absolutely. And everybody, regardless of their view on the appropriate use of nuclear weapons, ought to be concerned about the waste, fraud, and abuse that we allow to go on in our nuclear weapons complex. And so whether or not you think that there's a role for nuclear weapons for the triad, we should reduce or eliminate nuclear weapons, fundamentally, there is massive waste, fraud, and abuse. And let me give you a couple of examples. The Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, has told us that the nuclear weapons programs are going to be $62 billion over budget in the next 10 years. Over $62 billion over budget. So this is a program that we need to be reevaluating, asking ourselves, should we be reinvesting in something that's being mismanaged? And we really need to push back at some of the assumptions, some of the figures, some of the thinking that has been animating our nuclear weapons program, because it's proving time and time again to be wrong. The second example I'll offer you is that the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has said that the Air Force, which is pushing for a relaunch of the ICBM program, hasn't even done the math on what it will cost to create new missiles, to put them in our old silos. That's crazy. There should be a thoughtful, well-developed, and publicly debated with full oversight and transparency, including to the American people, about what we're doing with our nuclear weapons program and whether it's delivering the kind of national security and international peace that we all should be aiming for.
And it is so dire and so wasteful, as you've just mentioned. To follow up on that, earlier this year, you co-sponsored the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act of 2021. Can you explain this bill to our listeners as well and why it's important to you?
Yeah, the Restricting First Use Bill was introduced by my California colleague, Ted Lieu, who's really led on this issue, and Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts. And what it really does is locate our country's ability to decide to use nuclear weapons appropriately back in the congressional framework, which gives Congress and only Congress the power to declare war. There is nothing that more clearly meets the definition of war than using nuclear weapons. This is a huge, literally, life and death, our entire planet's at stake, the health of our entire planet. That should be something that's in Congress's powers. So what this says is there could be no first deployment by the United States of nuclear weapons without a congressional determination that that is what we should do. It does permit sort of responsive use. So there are people who think this bill could go farther. We could do more with regard to nuclear weapons. But what it really reflects is this longer term problem, which I know Plowshares has been thinking about, which is Congress giving away time and time again powers from the people and their elected representatives who are held accountable to the executive branch, and particularly to the Pentagon and to the network and web of defense contractors and those who occupy it. So we need to be strengthening congressional power in our national security policy and doing that in cooperation with the executive, but not allow the executive to dictate to Congress what our policies are going to be. And so this is a terrific bill restricting first use of nuclear weapons. It's going to make our world safer, but it's also about restoring those key principles of our democracy, including that Congress must be a check on the executive on certain kinds of acts, including declarations of war and the use of military force.
Katie, to expand on what you just described as regaining the war powers resolutions, the formula, the power, the structure that holds the executive branch accountable, you recently introduced the Accountability for Acting Officials Act. Tell us more about that legislation and how that plays into this dire situation.
Well, we've definitely seen the War Powers Act. It was passed a long time ago. Congress has passed authorizations to use military force since then. We need to modernize the War Powers Resolution, and we need to sunset these old AUMFs and really be thinking about what makes sense for a war power framework for the 21st century. We're now 21 years into it. It is past time to be thinking about this. And part of that is reevaluating how the War Powers Resolution and how other sort of allocations between the congressional powers and executive powers are affecting things in defense. And so the Accountability for Acting Officials Act, what it would do is limit the length of time that somebody could serve as an acting official. And why is that important? It's because we have these nominations and review and confirmation by the Senate precisely to ensure that the executive can't put any old person, unqualified, biased, not in the best interest of the American people, into these critically important jobs, including into inspector general roles. And under President Trump, we saw a lot of acting officials, but particularly concerning acting inspector generals. And inspector generals really were created by Congress after Watergate because of the systemic abuse in the executive. Those inspector generals are supposed to report to Congress and the president. But when the president can handpick that person and pick a person with not only no qualification, but perhaps a vested interest to look the other way when there is government overspending, then the inspector general program isn't going to serve its function and we're not going to have good oversight. So the whole purpose of the Accountability for Acting Officials Act is to make sure that acting officials are used sparingly and appropriately when we have a vacancy, and we're not substituting out appropriate congressional power for executive power.
Fantastic. I mean, this modernization of our foreign policy, of our national security policy, and it even has to go further. And you are the chair of the House Natural Resources Oversight Committee. And you've also been engaged in the reform of federal lands drilling programs to decrease methane emissions. Now, looking at this modernization, what does this proposal mean for the fight against climate change? That's a major national security issue that it needs modernization for us to tackle.
So you're absolutely right. Climate change is a huge national security issue. It may be globally our most pressing national security issue. And it has to be one of, if not the dominant, organizing principle for our foreign policy going forward. And some of these competing frameworks, we could be focusing on climate change as kind of an organizing principle for national security. Or, for example, we could be continuing to focus on building up for what is going to become a self-fulfilling, inevitable confrontation with China. That really goes counter to trying to deal with climate change because the military has a massive carbon footprint. And it makes the necessary cooperation on climate issues with China, for example, impossible when at the same time, it's very hard to cooperate on reducing emissions at the same time that you're building up for some kind of military confrontation with China. And so we are in the midst of what I hope is the end of decades-long buildup of our capacity to direct military force around the world. And a lot of that investment, importantly, and we see this so much in the Middle East, but not the only place. We also see it in places like Indonesia and our role in China and other countries, and increasingly in Africa with regard to minerals. So much of our national security, what we call vital national security interests, really boils down to access to fossil fuel for America and its allies. And so when we talk about American energy independence, that's not just about what fuel we use to drive our cars or heat our homes or run our factories. It's also about independence in the foreign policy sense, to not be making major military investment based on securing access to fossil fuels. And so thinking about climate mitigation, it's a major strategic alternative. We can think about the implications of things like mass migration that could be caused by climate change. We can think about strategic base locations, particularly for the Navy and things that are coastal. This has really huge implications to have rising sea levels. So I think that climate change needs to be a major part of how we think about national security going forward. And I think it's a better framework that will lead to better outcomes than the alternatives. With regard to the methane emissions and what's going on with that, this is another example of the need for oversight. So what's essentially happened is our public lands are public lands. They belong to all of us. They're there for us to recreate, to enjoy, to protect species. And Congress has basically been selling the right to drill on public lands on the cheap. It's a subsidy is what it is to oil and gas companies. And so we haven't raised the royalty rate to extract from our public lands in over 100 years. And the rate to extract from federal land is well behind what it is on state land. And we're not charging for things that have really serious climate impacts, including methane emission. So my colleague Diana DeGette has a bill that if you're going to take methane out of the land, you're not going to cap things. You're going to allow methane, which is a much more significant effect on climate change than even carbon dioxide. You want to have to pay for it. So this is all about, again, strategically and thoughtfully modernizing a system that is no longer making us safer and healthier, but is putting us at more risk.
Katie, you mentioned the climate issue as it relates to China. And as you know, we're currently celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. That unfortunately is coming during a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes here. You've been and always have been a supporter of the Asian American community here in the 45th District. Again, touching on what you said about combative relationship between China and the U.S., how does that combative nature of foreign policy toward Asia-Pacific region contribute to the rise of hate crimes here in our district across the country as it relates to the Asian American community?
It's a terrific question. And of course, we're facing it right now, particularly in this moment with regard to Asian Americans, those who are perceived to be, particularly whether they are or not Chinese Americans. But we've, of course, confronted this before in the wake of 9/11 with regard to Middle Eastern Americans, with regard to people who are or are perceived to be Muslim Americans. And the reality is our country's diversity is a huge strength. And we see that here in the 45th Congressional District. And so I think this is part of understanding that there's a very big difference between celebrating and respecting the different contributions people make to our country, whether they've been here for generations, whether they're Native Indigenous people, whether they're new immigrants. That is part and parcel of who our country is. And when we start to mix that up, what a Chinese American may be contributing to our community here as an exchange student, as a fourth generation American resident, as somebody whose family helped to build San Francisco, when we start confusing that with what China as a state actor is doing with regard to military action around the world, we shouldn't conflate those two things. For one thing, it strips away the American identity of Chinese Americans, and it reduces them to being nothing more than their, ancestral ethnicity, and completely negates their citizenship, their loyalty to this country. They're willing to serve in our military, to fight for our values, to defend our Constitution. And I think that's particularly why you see some of my colleagues like Ted Lieu, who is a veteran, really upset by some of this anti-Asian sentiment and some of this anti-Asian hate. He served our country as a Chinese American in our military, in our Air Force. He is an American. And so I think that this is, it's a disturbing time. And I think, frankly, it's a legacy of Donald Trump. But as we know, it didn't go away just when Trump went away. As unfortunately, we have long had these problems in our country with failing to recognize each individual's contributions, with addressing structural racism, with addressing systemic bias. Donald Trump made that problem so much worse, but he didn't create it. And now that he's out of office, it's not magically going to go away. It's going to take real work and really recognizing and seeing these diverse communities as what they are, which is part of our strength.
It's a powerful and effective resolution and answer, Katie. And as a Iranian American, I thank you. And we met through this diverse community in Irvine that is very powerful. It's a very, very diverse, very strong community. And it is a blueprint for not just the U.S., but the greater world of what diversity can do and what it can achieve in our homes, schools. And I've really been taken in by the district, and it's been my home now. It is my home. Katie, to dive even deeper on this issue, as we enter the AAPI Heritage Month, Plowshares Here has been reflecting on the history of the devastating effects of American nuclear weapon testings in the Pacific Islands. As you know, thousands of Marshall Islanders were killed or displaced due to U.S. weapons testing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. What is being done, or what can be done, to acknowledge this history and correct the injustices of our past as it relates to nuclear weapons testing?
Our country's legacy in the Marshall Islands is an incredibly important story for us to confront. We need to confront the realities of what we did as a nation in the Marshall Islands and the consequences of that head on. For one thing, it's a very important lesson for about how we should think about the risks of both nuclear weapons and climate change going forward. This is a great example of the need to look back at what we have done with clear eyes, to acknowledge the wrongs, to try to make them right, and then to learn from that as we try to set our nuclear weapon and climate change policy going forward. And I think this is an aspect of American history that it's not just not well known because it's Marshall Islands are far away geographically from the U.S., or it's not well known because this is ugly, what we did in the Marshall Islands. It's shameful, but we're only going to avoid these mistakes by dealing with it head on. So one of the things we're working on is trying to help lift up the story of the Marshallese people, of what happened in the Marshall Islands. So for listeners who may not know, from 1946, following World War II, until 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests on or over the Marshall Islands. And the radiation sort of yield on those tests works out to about 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day for 12 years. So, it was very important that we reflect on Hiroshima, on the decision to use, nuclear weapons to try to end World War II. But here we are inflicting multiples and multiples of this on a small community, and we have not even told them what the harm is from these tests. We continue to refuse to provide information to the very Marshallese people and to their government leaders about what we did. Where is the waste? Is it secure? What are the ongoing health hazards? So we need to give them full information, and we need to make sure it's available in translation for the Marshallese people. We did, as a result of our testing, even though we never took responsibility, we never said we did anything wrong or that we, were not honest with the Marshallese people about what we were doing, we did promise them access to Medicaid and free government health insurance. And the idea was this was sort of unofficial compensation for all of the very real sicknesses and harms and cancers that the Marshallese people are facing. But a drafting error, if you can believe it, in a 1995 bill took that away. It's a drafting error, should be easy to fix. But it took Congress 15 years to fix it. And it wasn't until this year, this end of last year here in 2020, that Senator Mazi Hirono from Hawaii, who pushed and pushed year after year to right this wrong and make sure the Marshallese people have access to Medicaid and to healthcare, to make that change. And so I think we all should be outraged by both how we used weapons there, the deception, the going back on our promise to address the harms of our actions there. But it's really important to me, particularly as a resident of Orange County. We were home to one of the first Marshallese communities to come from the Marshall Islands to seek better health and health care and treatment for cancers and other illnesses here. And the Natural Resources Committee, where I serve, has jurisdiction over U.S. programs in the Marshall Islands. So we're in a moment where we're not just reflecting on what does it mean to re-up our nuclear weapons program. That will mean testing. That will mean potentially taking some of these risks on again and producing some of these harms again. But we're also, our treaty that governs our relationship, the United States relationship with the Marshall Islands, is expiring soon. And there's debate about how and whether to reauthorize it. And so we really need to confront our past with the Marshall Islands to be able to come up with what the right approach is to reauthorizing that agreement. So I think this is a sort of fascinating but upsetting part of U.S. history. And as part of, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, I encourage people to learn more. And I'm really glad Plowshares is lifting up the stories of what's happened to the Marshallese community.
Katie, in continuation of what you just said, of the need to shed light on consequences of our foreign policy, over the past 2 decades, hate crimes against Americans of Mideast descent has been an unfortunate norm due to the warlike nature of U.S. foreign policy toward the region. We had Professor David Vine on our podcast, and his study at the American University in D.C. concluded that nearly 4 million people in the Middle East have died due to the recent U.S.-led wars. Can American investment in diplomacy, such as today's Iran nuclear deal, help move our foreign policy away from these devastating endless wars in the region and hopefully end its resulting racism here at home?
The United States has to reinvest and double down on diplomacy. And it's a result of our ever-connected world and the fact that our decisions to pursue a kind of warlike approach, to constantly be trying to weaponize American minds toward the other, as a means to justify defense spending in many cases rather than for legitimate national security needs. And that has an effect both on how we spend our resources as a country, but also in sort of who we think of as an enemy, who we think of as an ally, who we understand as potential allies, whether we're looking for the common thing on which we can come together with countries, or whether we're looking to seize the difference, the disagreement. And so, the consequences of some of our actions have created real fears and concerns, loss, grieving about what the United States role has been. 4 million people have died. Those are 4 million families who have lost loved ones at the hands of US-led wars. And so I think part of foreign policy is not just coming up with the preventative strategy or the security strategy. It's also taking full responsibility for the aftermath, for the after effects of your decision, and to try to think about what those are going to mean. And here in the United States, year after year, kind of being told that the Middle East is the number one security threat, whether that is or is not actually correct, has created more sort of heightened level of hate crimes toward people in the Middle East. So we're now seeing this play out with China, right? China is the new enemy, and therefore, is being offered up as the new enemy. And therefore, we're seeing that play into API hate crimes, as you mentioned. So we absolutely have to invest in diplomacy. And you mentioned the Iranian nuclear deal. I think it's a terrific example of one of the things about diplomacy is it isn't an on or off switch. You can't do it today and change your mind tomorrow. It is based fundamentally on trust. And trust requires time to build between people, between nations, these strategic alliances, our partnerships. And the Iranian nuclear deal is a great example of the United States, quote, changing its mind and essentially going back on a deal. That doesn't just affect our situation with Iran. It also affects our ability to make future deals, our credibility on the world stage, our ability to say to our allies, when we go to our allies and say, let's come together and work on a deal, they saw what happened in Iran. They saw that we turned away from that deal. And so I think we have some very strong and good leadership in the Biden administration to begin to reinvest in diplomacy. But I think the back and forth between the Obama administration and the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, that has consequences that last longer than the 4 years of the Trump administration. His foreign policy, I hate to even call it an approach, because I think it was a lot less disciplined than that, really will have consequences, not just for 4 years, but for 40 years in terms of trying to rebuild and reset some of those relationships and rebuild that trust.
Katie, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for so courageously and effectively representing my district. So I'm personally thanking you. And by doing so, serving our greater country. And you really represent for me the future and the strength of this country, this beautiful country, and all of its policy and its national security, which is very important. And I think you're touching on issues that are really important to the interests of the United States of America. So I'm grateful to be a citizen in your district. And thank you for joining us, Katie.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Derek Sender, Will Lowry, and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.